Harlem, 1957. A corrupt police chief just made the worst mistake of his career. He threatened the wrong man. Bumpy Johnson didn't beg, didn't negotiate, didn't run. Instead, he delivered an ultimatum that would echo through Harlem's streets for decades. This is the night when fear changed sides forever. Before we understand the man who could stare down a police chief and make him blink, we need to understand where Bumpy Johnson came from. And let me tell you, his story didn't start with power. It started with a boy from Charleston, South Carolina, who had a bump on the back of his head and a fire in his soul that wouldn't quit. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in 1905 in Charleston. That bump on his head, the one that gave him his nickname, made him a target for ridicule as a kid. But Bumpy learned early that the world doesn't care about your struggles. It only cares about your response. When his older brother Willie was accused of murdering a white man, the Johnson family knew what that meant in 1915 South Carolina. A black man accused of killing a white man? That was a death sentence. Trial or no trial. So they did what thousands of black families did during that era. They sent their children north, to Harlem, where at least you had a fighting chance. Bumpy arrived in Harlem in 1919, and the streets raised him. By his teenage years, he was already deep in the game. Burglary, pimping, whatever it took to survive. Here's the thing about Bumpy that separated him from every other street hustler. He was brilliant. Not just street smart. Actually brilliant. The man would read Shakespeare in prison. He wrote poetry that was published during the Harlem Renaissance. He played chess like a grandmaster. But instead of using that intellect for a classroom, he used it for the streets. And in the 1930s, those streets were controlled by a woman named Stephanie Saint. Claire, the queen of numbers. St. Clair saw something in the young Bumpy Johnson. Maybe it was his strategic mind. Maybe it was his absolute fearlessness. Whatever it was, she took him under her wing, made him her enforcer, her right hand. And when German-Jewish mobster Dutch Schultz tried to muscle in on Harlem's numbers racket, it was Bumpy who went to war. Not a loud war. A smart war, as his wife Mame later wrote. Bumpy and his crew of 9 waged a guerrilla war of sorts. And picking off Dutch Schultz's men was easy, since there were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day. Think about that strategy. Bumpy turned Harlem itself into a weapon. Every street corner was intelligence. Every face in the crowd could be one of his soldiers. Schultz's men stood out, and Bumpy made them disappear, one by one. By the time Schultz was assassinated by the Italian mob in 1935, Bumpy had proven himself as more than muscle. He was a tactician, and that's when he did something no black gangster had ever done before. He sat down with Charles Lucky Luciano, the most powerful mobster in America, and negotiated a deal. Not as a subordinate, as a partner. Bumpy would control all of Harlem's rackets independently, and the Italian mob would get a cut of the profits. It was unprecedented. For the first time, a black man had stood up to the white mob and gotten a deal with honor. The people of Harlem noticed, but power always comes with a price. In 1952, federal authorities finally caught up with Bumpy. He was sentenced to 15 years for drug conspiracy, and he spent most of that time in the most infamous prison in America, Alcatraz. The Rock, where Al Capone lost his mind, and men went crazy from isolation. But not Bumpy. Inmates remembered him as quiet, focused, always reading, always playing chess. He did his time with his mind intact, and when he was released in 1963, just months before Alcatraz closed forever, he returned to Harlem like a king, coming back to his kingdom. They literally threw him a parade. By 1957, when our story takes place, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a crime boss. He was an institution. The community feared him, yes, but they also loved him. He was the guy who'd slip cash to families who couldn't pay rent. The guy who'd lecture kids in the neighborhood to stay in school instead of following his path. The guy who commanded respect from everyone, from street hustlers to celebrities like Billie Holiday and Sugar Ray Robinson. But here's what the police chief didn't understand. What corrupt cops never understood about Bumpy Johnson. His power didn't come from violence alone. It came from respect, from strategy, from an intelligence network that knew everything happening in Harlem before it happened. And when you threaten a man like that, when you give him an ultimatum like he's some scared street punk, you're not just disrespecting him. You're challenging the entire system he built. You're forcing him to respond. Because in Harlem's hierarchy of power, backing down wasn't an option. It was suicide. The police were about to learn that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a general. And they'd just declared war on the wrong army. Let me tell you about the other side of this chessboard. Because while Bumpy Johnson was building his empire on respect and fear, the NIP was running their own criminal organization. And it was legal. Or at least, nobody could stop it. In 1950s Harlem, the police weren't there to serve and protect. They were there to collect. Every bar owner, every numbers runner, every shop that sold cigarettes after hours, they all paid the tax. Not to the city, to the cops. It was an open secret. Officers would walk into businesses with their hands out. And if you didn't fill those hands with cash, your business would burn down. Or you'd get arrested on trumped-up charges. Or you'd just disappear one night, and nobody would ask questions, because nobody wanted to be next. The chief at the center of our story, let's call him Chief Thomas Sullivan, was the architect of this whole corrupt system. Now, Sullivan wasn't some rogue cop gone bad. He'd been dirty from day one, climbing the ranks by protecting the right politicians and squeezing the right neighborhoods. By the time he made chief, he'd perfected the game. He had a whole crew of officers under him, men who'd sold their badges the same day they earned them. These weren't cops. They were armed tax collectors with qualified immunity. Sullivan's reputation in Harlem was darker than any gangster's. At least with Bumpy, you knew the rules. You paid what you owed, you kept your word, and you'd be left alone. With Sullivan, the rules changed whenever he felt like it. He'd demand $500 one month, then come back 2 weeks later demanding 1,000 more. He'd beat men in the street in broad daylight, knowing no judge would convict a police chief. He'd arrest women on prostitution charges just to extort their families. And the worst part? He seemed to enjoy it. There were stories that spread through Harlem like ghost tales. The bartender who refused to pay and was found in an alley with 3 broken ribs and no memory of who did it. The numbers runner who threatened to report Sullivan to the mayor and ended up doing 5 years on a planted weapons charge. The teenage boy who looked at Sullivan the wrong way and was beaten so badly he never walked right again. Fear wasn't just Sullivan's tool. It was his entertainment. Sullivan had learned something crucial about power. In a racist system, he could do anything to black people and face 0 consequences. The courts didn't care. City Hall didn't care. The newspapers certainly didn't care. Harlem was his personal kingdom, and he ruled it with a nightstick and a service revolver. His crew of dirty cops followed his lead. Officers like Danny O'Reilly, a red-faced Irish bruiser who'd crack skulls for $20 and a bottle of whiskey. Like Frank Moretti, who'd shake down businesses and pocket evidence from crime scenes. These men wore badges, but they operated like a gang. Sullivan's gang. But here's where Sullivan made his critical mistake, the miscalculation that would cost him everything. He started believing his own mythology. He'd terrorized Harlem for so long without consequences that he forgot there were some men you couldn't terrorize. Some men who had their own power, their own armies, their own rules. Sullivan looked at Bumpy Johnson and saw just another black criminal he could push around. He didn't see the intelligence network. He didn't see the loyalty Bumpy commanded. He didn't see the strategic mind that had outmaneuvered Dutch Schultz and negotiated with Lucky Luciano. What Sullivan saw was simple. Bumpy controlled the numbers racket, and Sullivan wanted a bigger cut. He'd been collecting his regular payments, sure, but Bumpy's organization was making serious money, and Sullivan's greed had been growing like cancer. He wanted it all, and in his arrogance, he thought his badge made him untouchable. He thought the law was on his side. So how could a black gangster, no matter how powerful, possibly stand against him? The escalation had been building for months. Sullivan started demanding more money. Bumpy refused. Sullivan arrested some of Bumpy's men on bogus charges. Bumpy got them lawyers, and they walked. Sullivan raided one of Bumpy's gambling operations. Bumpy opened 2 more the next week. It was a chess match, and Sullivan was losing. That's what made him dangerous. A cornered, desperate man with a badge and a gun is the most dangerous thing in the world. So Sullivan decided to make a power play that would settle things once and for all. He'd go straight to Bumpy, use the full weight of his authority, and run him out of Harlem. Simple. Clean. Final. In Sullivan's mind, Bumpy had 2 choices: leave town or spend the rest of his life fighting arrests, raids, and legal bills until his whole empire crumbled. What Sullivan didn't factor in was a third option. The option where Bumpy Johnson said no. The chief thought his badge made him untouchable. He was wrong, and he was about to find out just how wrong in the most terrifying night of his life. The confrontation happened on a Thursday night in September. The precinct was quiet. Most officers out on patrol or at home. Sullivan had planned it that way. This was going to be a private conversation, the kind where he laid down the law and Bumpy either accepted it or faced consequences that would destroy him. Sullivan sat behind his desk in his office on the 2nd floor smoking a cigar when his sergeant brought Bumpy Johnson in. Bumpy walked into that office like he owned it. That's the first thing Sullivan would remember later. No nervousness. No deference. Bumpy wore a tailored gray suit that probably cost more than Sullivan made in a month. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He carried himself with the posture of a man who'd negotiated with Lucky Luciano and survived Alcatraz. And when he looked at Chief Sullivan, his eyes were cold and calculating, like he was already 3 moves ahead in a game Sullivan didn't know he was playing. "Sit down, Bumpy," Sullivan said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. He didn't stand, didn't offer a handshake, just the casual disrespect of a man who thought he held all the power. Bumpy sat, crossed one leg over the other, waited. Sullivan leaned back in his chair, letting the silence stretch. It was an intimidation tactic he'd used 1,000 times. Let them sweat. Let them wonder what's coming. But Bumpy didn't sweat. He just watched Sullivan with those unreadable eyes, patient as death itself. "You know why you're here," Sullivan finally said, tapping ash from his cigar into a tray. "You've been a problem, Bumpy. A problem I'm done tolerating. That right?" Bumpy's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "That's right, boy." Sullivan leaned forward now, and you could hear the venom in his voice. "You think you run Harlem? You don't run nothing. I run Harlem. I run every street, every corner, every two-bit numbers game in this whole godforsaken neighborhood. And I'm tired of you acting like you're somebody. Bumpy's expression didn't change, but anyone who knew him would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes. That was the tell. That was the moment Sullivan crossed a line he didn't even know existed. Sullivan kept going, too drunk on his own authority to see the danger. So here's what's going to happen. You've got 24 hours to pack up your business, your family, everything, and get the hell out of my city. You go to Chicago, Detroit, I don't give a damn where, but if I see your face in Harlem after tomorrow night, I will bury you. I will arrest everyone you know. I will raid every business you touch. I will make your life such a living hell that you'll wish you never heard the word Harlem. He paused, letting his ultimatum sink in. Then he added the final insult, the one that sealed his fate. You understand me, boy? That word again. Boy. It wasn't just disrespect. It was everything. The racism, the power imbalance, the assumption that a badge made Sullivan's life worth more than Bumpy's. It was the sound of a system that had crushed black people for centuries, concentrated into 4 letters. Bumpy uncrossed his legs, stood up slowly. Sullivan's hand instinctively moved toward the gun on his hip, but Bumpy just buttoned his suit jacket with careful, deliberate movements. When he spoke, his voice was still quiet, but now there was something underneath it, something that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Chief Sullivan, Bumpy said, pronouncing each word with surgical precision. I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Sullivan's bravado flickered. Just for a second. Just long enough for doubt to creep in. You just gave me 24 hours to leave Harlem, Bumpy continued. That's real generous of you. Real generous. But I'm afraid I can't accept those terms. He paused, let the words hang in the air. Instead, I'm going to give you different terms. You've got 1 hour to live. The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of before. A suffocating silence. The kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Sullivan laughed. It sounded forced. You threatening a police chief, Bumpy? That's a crime. That's assaulting an officer. I could have you in handcuffs right now. Then put me in handcuffs, Bumpy said. He held out his wrists, calm as a man offering to shake hands. Go ahead. Arrest me. See what happens. Sullivan didn't move, because in that moment, sitting in his own office surrounded by his own men in his own precinct, he suddenly wasn't sure he could. The power dynamic had shifted without him realizing when. How did that happen? How did Bumpy Johnson walk into his office as a suspect and leave as the man in control? Bumpy lowered his hands. 1 hour, Chief. I suggest you use it wisely. Maybe call your family. Make your peace. Because when that hour is up, we're going to see if that badge stops bullets. Then he walked out. Just turned and walked out of the office, down the stairs, and out of the precinct. Sullivan's sergeant moved to stop him, but Sullivan waved him off. His hand was shaking. He tried to hide it by reaching for his cigar, but it had gone out. Bumpy Johnson had just threatened to kill a police chief in the police station and walked away free. The clock was ticking, but whose time was running out? Sullivan tried to convince himself it was Bumpy's. Tried to tell himself this was just another thug making empty threats. But deep down in that part of his brain that had kept him alive through 20 years of police work, he knew the truth. He'd just made the worst mistake of his life. and he had 57 minutes to figure out what to do about it. Bumpy walked out of that precinct at 9:47 p.m. By 9:52, every key player in his organization knew exactly what had happened. That's how Bumpy's network worked. Information moved through Harlem faster than electricity through a wire. He walked 3 blocks to a social club on 125th Street, an unassuming door between a barber shop and a pawn shop. Inside, past the legitimate card games and the men drinking whiskey, there was a back room. By the time Bumpy arrived, 6 of his most trusted lieutenants were already there. These weren't street thugs. These were strategists. Vietnam veterans before Vietnam. Men who understood that violence was a tool, not a solution, and that the best battles were won before the first shot was fired. Bumpy sat down at the head of the table, lit a cigarette, let them wait. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same quiet intensity it had in Sullivan's office. "We've got 1 hour," he said. "Here's what we do." The beauty of Bumpy's operation was its intelligence network. While the Italian mob relied on brute force, and the Irish gangs relied on political connections, Bumpy had built something different, something better. He had eyes everywhere. The shoeshine kid on the corner who watched who came and went from the precinct. The waitress at the diner where cops ate lunch. The janitor who cleaned city hall offices and read the documents in the trash. The taxi drivers who knew every route through Harlem and who took them. Bumpy didn't just control Harlem's criminal underworld. He understood its entire ecosystem. Within 10 minutes of Bumpy leaving the precinct, his network had confirmed Sullivan's location. Still in his office, making phone calls. The panic was setting in. Good. Fear made people predictable. "He'll go home eventually," one of Bumpy's men said. "Man like that, he thinks his house is safe." "Where does he live?" Bumpy asked, though he already knew. He always knew. Forest Hills. Queens. White neighborhood. "Thinks we can't touch him there." Bumpy smiled. Not a warm smile. A chess player's smile when they've seen the winning combination. "He's right. We're not going to touch him there. We're going to touch him on the way there." He pulled out a map of Manhattan and Queens, spread it across the table. His finger traced the route from the precinct in Harlem to Sullivan's house in Forest Hills. There were multiple routes Sullivan could take, but Bumpy knew his habits. Sullivan was a creature of routine. He'd take the Triborough Bridge, then Grand Central Parkway. Same route he'd taken for 8 years. Why would tonight be different? "Here," Bumpy said, tapping a spot on the map. "A stretch of road through East Harlem. Before the bridge. Less trafficked at night. Fewer witnesses. This is where we intercept him." One of his lieutenants, a man named Marcus who'd done time with Bumpy in Alcatraz, leaned forward. "You really going to do this, Bump? Kill a police chief? They'll bring the whole NID down on Harlem. They'll turn this place into a war zone." Bumpy looked at Marcus with those cold, calculating eyes. "You think I want to kill him? You think I enjoy this? But that man gave me an ultimatum in front of witnesses. If I back down, I'm done. Every cop, every two-bit hustler, every crew from Brooklyn to the Bronx will know Bumpy Johnson can be pushed. I might as well pack my bags right now." He paused, let that sink in. "This isn't about what I want. This is about what has to happen. So what's the play?" another lieutenant asked. Bumpy stubbed out his cigarette. "Information. That's always the play. I need to know when Sullivan leaves that precinct. I need to know which car he's driving. I need to know if he's alone or if he's got protection. And I need to know all of this in real time." Phone calls went out. The network activated like a military operation. The shoeshine kid was positioned across from the precinct with instructions to call the moment Sullivan came out. Two taxi drivers were stationed at different points along Sullivan's route, ready to relay his position. A bartender at a spot near the Triborough Bridge kept his phone next to the register, ready to confirm when Sullivan passed. Every piece moving into position. But Bumpy wasn't just gathering intelligence. He was sending a message, a psychological message. Because by 10:10 p.m., Sullivan's phone in the precinct started ringing. When he answered, silence. Then it would ring again. Different number. More silence. His home phone in Queens rang. His wife answered. The person on the other end asked for the chief, then hung up when she tried to connect them. It was subtle, just subtle enough to let Sullivan know. We know where you are. We know where your family is. We're watching. At 10:15, 28 minutes after Bumpy had walked out of the precinct, Sullivan's car was vandalized. Slashed tires. Broken windows. Right in the police parking lot, surrounded by cops. And nobody saw a thing. Because even some of those cops were on Bumpy's payroll. Even inside the precinct, Sullivan was isolated. Bumpy knew what Sullivan was thinking. He could imagine the chief sitting in his office, trying to make sense of what was happening. Trying to decide if this was a real threat or a bluff. Trying to figure out if he should call for backup or if that would make him look weak. The indecision was the point. Keep him off balance. Keep him guessing. At 10:20, Bumpy got the call he'd been waiting for. He's moving. Just left the precinct. Black sedan. 2 officers with him for protection. Bumpy nodded to his men. Positions. Now, they moved like shadows. 3 cars, strategically placed along Sullivan's route. Not together. Spread out. Waiting. Bumpy rode in the lead car, sitting in the back seat, watching the streets of Harlem pass by his window. This was his kingdom. Every brick, every storefront, every face in every window. He'd built this empire one strategic move at a time, and he wasn't about to let some corrupt cop with a badge take it away. The radio crackled. Target approaching 125th Street. Right on schedule. 30 minutes in, the trap was set. Sullivan still didn't know he was already surrounded. He still thought he could make it home, call in reinforcements, and crush Bumpy Johnson with the full weight of the nip behind him. He was wrong, and he was about to find out just how wrong in the most terrifying 30 minutes of his life. Sullivan's black sedan crawled through Harlem like a wounded animal, trying to find its way home. He sat in the back seat, 2 of his officers up front, and with every block that passed, the sense of wrongness grew stronger. The streets were too quiet. Where were the usual crowds? The people hanging out on stoops, the music spilling from open windows. It was like the whole neighborhood had been evacuated. Like everyone knew something he didn't. Something's off, he muttered to his driver, Officer O'Reilly. O'Reilly glanced in the rearview mirror. What do you mean, Chief? Just drive faster. Get us to the bridge. But fast wasn't an option, because at 10:25 p.m., exactly 35 minutes after Bumpy's ultimatum, traffic materialized out of nowhere. A delivery truck stalled in the middle of 125th Street. A taxi with a mysteriously flat tire blocking the turn lane. Pedestrians crossing at exactly the wrong moments. Nothing overtly aggressive, just delays, one after another after another. Sullivan's phone rang. He answered it immediately, hoping it was backup he'd called for. Instead, silence. Then a click. He tried calling the precinct. Busy signal. Tried his wife. No answer. Every lifeline he reached for dissolved in his hands. Take the side streets, he ordered. Get us off the main roads. That's exactly what Bumpy wanted. Because the main roads had witnesses. Side streets? That's where shadows lived. O'Reilly turned down a darker street, less traffic lined with warehouses and closed businesses. The street lights were out. Not all of them. Just enough to create pockets of darkness. Sullivan's hand moved to his service revolver, unholstered it, kept it in his lap. The other officer, Moretti, did the same. "Chief, we should call for backup," Moretti said, his voice tight with tension. "From who?" Sullivan snapped. "Half the precinct is probably on Bumpy's payroll. You trust anyone right now?" That's when he realized how completely Bumpy had isolated him. The system Sullivan had relied on, the corrupt network he'd built, the officers who'd followed his orders, all of it was compromised. Bumpy hadn't just threatened him. He dismantled his entire support structure in less than an hour. At 10:35, the car made it to 132nd Street. Quieter, darker. And then the engine coughed. Once, twice. Then died completely. "No," Sullivan whispered. "No, no, no." O'Reilly turned the key. Nothing. Tried again. Dead silence. "Pop the hood," Sullivan ordered, but his voice had lost its authority. It sounded desperate. O'Reilly got out, lifted the hood, peered inside with a flashlight. "Chief, someone cut the fuel line. Recently. The cut's clean." That's when Sullivan understood. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't intimidation. This was an execution, and he was watching it unfold step by step. The traffic delays to route them here. The street lights out to provide cover. The sabotaged car. This corner, this exact corner, had been chosen. Bumpy had known exactly where Sullivan would be at exactly what time. "Get on the radio," Sullivan said, his voice shaking now. "Call for backup. Every available unit." But when Moretti reached for the radio, it was dead too. Battery disconnected. When had that happened? How long had they been driving a dead car through Harlem without knowing it? The three officers stood in the street now, backs to the car, guns drawn, scanning the darkness. The warehouse to their left, the abandoned factory to their right, an alley behind them. Too many angles, too many places for shadows to hide. Then the shadows moved. Men emerged from the darkness. Not running. Not shouting. Just walking with the calm purpose of professionals, doing a job. 6 of them. 8. 10. Sullivan lost count. They carried weapons, bats, chains, guns, but they held them loose, almost casual. They formed a half circle around Sullivan and his men, closing off any escape route. And then Bumpy Johnson stepped out of a car parked at the end of the block. He walked toward them slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silent street. Still wearing that gray suit, still looking like he was headed to a business meeting instead of a confrontation. When he got close enough for Sullivan to see his face clearly, Bumpy stopped. Smiled that cold smile. "Your hour is up, Chief." Sullivan raised his gun, pointed it at Bumpy's chest. His hand was shaking so badly the barrel wavered. "You stay back. I'll shoot. I swear to God I'll shoot." Bumpy didn't even flinch. "Go ahead. Shoot a man in front of a dozen witnesses. Kill me right here in the street. Then what? You think my men just let you walk away? You think you make it to the bridge?" He took a step closer. Sullivan's gun didn't stop him. "You're not leaving Harlem tonight, Chief. The only question is how you leave. In handcuffs or in a body bag." O'Reilly and Moretti had their guns out too, but you could see the calculation in their eyes. They were outnumbered 3-1. They were in Bumpy Johnson's territory, surrounded by his men. And their boss had just been outplayed so completely, it was almost impressive. Sullivan's mind was racing, trying to find a way out. "You can't do this. I'm a police chief. You kill me, they'll hunt you down. They'll execute you. Bumpy laughed. Actually laughed. Execute me? Chief, I've been to Alcatraz. You think I'm scared of prison? Besides, I'm not going to kill you. Relief flooded Sullivan's face. Just for a second. Unless you make me. Bumpy continued. See, I came here to offer you a choice. The same kind of choice you offered me. Except mine is more generous. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, extended it toward Sullivan. What is that? Sullivan asked. Your resignation letter. Already typed up. You sign it, dated tonight, effective immediately. Cite health reasons. Stress. Whatever. Tomorrow morning it's on the mayor's desk. By noon you're on a train to anywhere that's not New York. You take your pension, your family, and you disappear. You never come back. You never talk about what happened tonight. And you get to live. Sullivan stared at the envelope like it was a snake. And if I don't sign? Bumpy's expression didn't change. Then we find out if your body floats or sinks in the East River. And tomorrow, you're just another missing person. Another unsolved case. Harlem's full of them. The silence stretched. Sullivan looked at his men, hoping for, what? Support? They wouldn't meet his eyes. They knew the score. This was over. It had been over since Bumpy walked into Sullivan's office and called his bluff. Sullivan's entire identity was wrapped up in that badge. 20 years of climbing the ranks, taking what he wanted, ruling Harlem with an iron fist. And now this, being forced to throw it all away by the very man he'd tried to run out of town. The humiliation was almost worse than the fear. But humiliation you could survive. A bullet to the head was permanent. With shaking hands, Sullivan lowered his gun, reached out, took the envelope. Bumpy handed him a pen, and one of his men provided a car hood to write on. Under the dim light of a street lamp, Chief Thomas Sullivan signed away his career, his power, his entire life in New York. Bumpy took the letter, examined the signature, folded it carefully, and put it back in his jacket. One more thing, Bumpy said. You've got exactly 12 hours to be out of the state. If I hear you stop by the precinct, if you try to warn anyone, if you do anything except pack a bag and leave, this offer expires. We clear? Sullivan nodded. He couldn't speak. His whole body was shaking. Bumpy gestured to his men. They parted, creating a path. There's a cab waiting on the next block. It'll take you home. I suggest you don't waste time. Sullivan and his men walked through the gauntlet of Bumpy's crew, every step feeling like it might be their last. When they reached the cab, Sullivan turned back one more time. Bumpy was still standing there, watching. Why? Sullivan asked. Why let me live? Bumpy considered the question. Because dead, you're a martyr. Alive, you're a lesson. Every cop in New York is going to know what happened here tonight. They're going to know that Bumpy Johnson made a police chief resign at gunpoint. They're going to know that badges don't mean nothing in Harlem unless Harlem says they do. He paused. You wanted to know who runs this neighborhood, Chief? Now you know. The cab drove away into the night. Sullivan would be on a train to Florida by morning, carrying nothing but a suitcase, and the knowledge that he'd been beaten at his own game. Bumpy's men started to celebrate, but he held up a hand for silence. Clean this up, he said. No trace. And someone get that car towed before morning. As his crew dispersed into the night, Bumpy stood alone on that dark corner for just a moment. He'd won. He'd faced down the law and made it blink, but there was no joy in his expression. Just the weight of a man who'd been forced to prove, once again, that respect in Harlem was earned in blood and fear. He lit a cigarette, looked up at the Harlem sky, and walked back to his car, already thinking 3 moves ahead in a game that never ended. By 7 AM the next morning, Chief Thomas Sullivan's resignation letter was on Mayor Robert Wagner's desk. By 8 AM, the news had spread through the nib like wildfire. By noon, every cop in New York knew what nobody would say out loud. Bumpy Johnson had just done the impossible. The official story was simple. Sullivan resigned due to health reasons. Stress, high blood pressure. The demands of the job had become too much. The mayor accepted the resignation with regret, thanked Sullivan for his years of service, and appointed an interim chief. Clean, professional, completely false. But in Harlem, they knew the truth, and the truth spread like a religion. The story grew with each telling. Some versions had Bumpy holding a gun to Sullivan's head. Others said he'd beaten Sullivan unconscious and left him bleeding in an alley. A few claimed he'd kidnapped Sullivan's family and ransomed them for the resignation. The details changed, but the core remained the same. A black man had stood up to the most powerful police chief in New York and made him back down. In 1957 America, that was more than a story. That was mythology. Old men would tell it to young boys on street corners, using it as a lesson in power and respect. Mothers would whisper it as a warning to daughters about the dangerous men who ran the neighborhood. Musicians would reference it in jazz clubs, and poets would write about it in the same breath as tales of railroad workers and folk heroes. Bumpy Johnson, the man who made the police chief quit. But here's what made the aftermath even more significant. It worked. For a while at least, police harassment in Harlem decreased. Not disappeared. This was still 1950s America, still a deeply racist system, but decreased. Cops who used to walk into businesses with their hands out started being more careful. The random beatings, the trumped-up arrests, the casual violence that had been part of daily life in Harlem, it all pulled back a notch. Why? Because every officer in the NIPD looked at what happened to Sullivan and did the math. Was the extortion money worth potentially ending up like him? Humiliated, powerless, run out of town by a man they'd been taught to see as inferior? Some cops decided it wasn't worth it. They took their legal paychecks and went home to their families. The really corrupt ones just moved to other neighborhoods, places where the power dynamics were clearer. For Bumpy, this night became part of a larger pattern that defined his entire criminal career. He wasn't like Al Capone, flashy and violent, and ultimately destroyed by his own excess. He wasn't like Lucky Luciano, brilliant, but eventually deported and diminished. Bumpy was different. He used strategic violence, yes, but always as a last resort. His real weapon was psychological warfare. Make them afraid before you make them bleed. Make them respect you before you make them fear you. This is what people often miss about Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't just a crime boss. He was a strategist who happened to work in crime. The night with Sullivan wasn't about killing a cop or proving how tough he was. It was about sending a message that would echo long after the confrontation ended. It was about establishing boundaries that even the law couldn't cross. The community's reaction was complicated, nuanced in a way that outsiders never understood. On one hand, there was fear. Bumpy Johnson had just proven he could orchestrate the downfall of a police chief in under an hour. What else could he do? Who else could he destroy? Parents told their kids to stay clear of him, to never get involved in anything that might put them on his radar. But there was also pride, quiet, unspoken pride. Because in a world where black men were beaten for looking at white women the wrong way, where they couldn't vote in half the country, where they were treated as second-class citizens in every aspect of their lives, Bumpy Johnson had made a powerful white man back down. He'd won a battle that wasn't supposed to be winnable. And for people living under the constant weight of oppression, that victory meant something. It meant the system wasn't invincible. It meant power could be challenged. The long-term consequences for nipped Harlem relations were complex. On one level, the Sullivan incident created a kind of tente, an unspoken understanding that there were limits to what cops could do in Harlem without consequences. But it also hardened certain attitudes. Some officers saw what happened to Sullivan as a declaration of war. They became more careful, yes, but also more resentful. That resentment would fuel decades of tension between police and the black community, a tension that exists to this day. Bumpy himself rarely spoke about that night. His wife, Mame, later wrote about his philosophy on violence. Bumpy was not a violent man. He was a strategic man. He used violence the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, only when necessary, and always with a specific outcome in mind. The Sullivan confrontation embodied that philosophy perfectly. One night. One confrontation. Years of consequences. The story became part of his mythology. But here's what people often forget. Bumpy Johnson lived another 11 years after that night. He continued running his empire, continued being the unofficial Godfather of Harlem, continued navigating the complex world of organized crime and community politics. He became friends with Malcolm X, providing protection during some of the civil rights leaders' most dangerous moments. He mentored young men, trying to steer them away from the life that had consumed him. He played chess in Marcus Garvey Park and lectured kids about staying in school. But on July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson collapsed in Wells Restaurant on Lenox Avenue. Heart attack. He was 62 years old. The man who'd survived gang wars, police raids, 15 years in prison including time in Alcatraz, who'd outmaneuvered Dutch Schultz and negotiated with Lucky Luciano, who'd made a police chief resign at gunpoint, died from his own heart. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Bumpy Johnson had been untouchable from the outside. Every enemy who'd tried to kill him had failed. Every cop who'd tried to break him had failed. But his own body, worn down by decades of stress and struggle and the constant weight of running an empire in a racist society. That was the only thing that could stop him. His funeral was attended by hundreds. Street hustlers stood next to church-going grandmothers, former convicts next to legitimate businessmen. The entire neighborhood came out to pay respects to a man who'd been both protector and predator, both Robin Hood and ruthless crime boss. So was Bumpy Johnson a hero or a villain? That's the question people still debate. And honestly, he was both. He was neither. He was a man who existed in the complicated gray space that American racism created, in a system where the law was lawless, where the police were criminals with badges, where black people had no legal recourse for injustice. Bumpy Johnson made his own justice. Was it moral? Depends on your perspective. Was it effective? The resignation of Chief Thomas Sullivan suggests it was. Here's what I think. Bumpy Johnson was a product of his time, his circumstances, and his choices. He chose crime, yes, but he chose it in a world that offered him few other choices. He chose violence, but only in a world that was already violent toward him. And when he exercised power, he did it with a a strategy, a philosophy that set him apart from the chaotic brutality of many of his contemporaries. The night he made Chief Sullivan resign wasn't about good versus evil. It was about power versus power. It was about a man who refused to be threatened, refused to be moved, refused to accept someone else's definition of his place in the world. In that moment, on that dark Harlem street, Bumpy Johnson rewrote the rules. He proved that respect couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned. And fear? Fear could flow both ways. Would you have done the same in his position? Would you have walked away when Sullivan gave that ultimatum? Or would you have fought back? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I'm genuinely curious where you all stand on this. The story of Bumpy Johnson and Chief Sullivan isn't just history. It's a lens into questions we're still grappling with today. When the system is corrupt, what's the moral response? When the law is lawless, where do you find justice? When peaceful means fail, what comes next? These aren't easy questions, and Bumpy Johnson's life doesn't provide easy answers. But it forces us to ask them. Outro: the price of power. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, but his legend lives on. That night with Chief Sullivan became part of Harlem folklore, a story told and retold until it took on mythic proportions. Some details got exaggerated, others got lost. But the core truth remained. A man stood up to the system and won. The irony is brutal when you think about it. Bumpy survived countless gang wars. He walked out of Alcatraz sane when Al Capone went mad. He navigated the treacherous world of organized crime for 40 years, making allies of men who'd kill their own mothers for the right price. He faced down corrupt cops, rival gangs, federal investigators. He was untouchable, until his own heart stopped. July 7th, 1968. Wells Restaurant on Lenox Avenue. One moment he was playing cards and laughing with friends. The next, he collapsed, dead before the ambulance arrived. 62 years old. You can survive bullets and betrayal and prison, but you can't negotiate with your own mortality. The man who controlled Harlem couldn't control his own heartbeat. There's something almost poetic about that. The Godfather of Harlem, defeated not by an enemy, but by biology. So what's Bumpy Johnson's legacy? Was he a Robin Hood figure who protected his community and stood up to corrupt police? Or was he a ruthless crime boss who profited from human suffering? The answer, uncomfortable as it is both. He fed people during the Depression and ran illegal gambling. He protected Harlem from outside gangs and controlled it himself. He helped civil rights leaders and sold drugs that destroyed families. He was a contradiction, a criminal with a code, a violent man who preached education, a street king who read Shakespeare. In a just world, Bumpy Johnson wouldn't have needed to exist. But the world wasn't just. So he made his own justice. And we're still arguing about whether that was heroic or horrible. Here's what I believe. Bumpy Johnson was a product of a system that gave black men in 1930s America two choices: accept oppression or fight back. He chose to fight, and he fought with every weapon he had. Was violence the answer? Maybe not. But when the system itself is violent, when the law protects criminals with badges and brutalizes innocent people, what's the alternative? That's the question his life poses. Not whether he was good or bad, that's too simple, but whether the world that created him was just. And if it wasn't, whether his response was reasonable given the circumstances. If this story gripped you, if it made you think, if it sparked something, hit that subscribe button. Because next time, we're diving into an even more incredible chapter of Bumpy Johnson's life, the night Malcolm X came to him for protection. The civil rights icon and the crime boss forming an alliance that would shake both the political and criminal worlds. Sometimes the only way to survive the game is to change the rules. Bumpy Johnson rewrote them in blood and strategy and sheer force of will. He proved that power respects power, regardless of what badge you wear or what color your skin is. And on that September night in 1957, when a police chief tried to run him out of town, Bumpy Johnson sent a message that echoed through Harlem for generations. This is my city. And in my city, I make the rules.